Okay, on to a discussion of Chapter 9 and Congress.
And here are our learning outcomes for the week. We'll define key roles played by Congress. We'll identify why the U.S. developed a bicameral legislature and the key differences between the House and the Senate. We'll evaluate the processes of reapportioning and redistricting House seats and possible solutions to gerrymandering. We'll identify the key leadership positions in each chamber and the committee structure. And we'll outline the process by which a bill becomes a law.
Okay, to recap a bit, why was Congress created? We know that the founding generation of this country feared a strong executive. We also know they didn't want too much power in the hands of a national government, but they also had experienced a weakness of Congress under the Articles of Confederation, where it didn't have a lot of power, and there wasn't enough role for the majority of people to express their voice. So this is where we come up with a bicameral legislature, one, the Senate, that each state is represented equally, and the other, the House of Representatives, which is based on population. And this, of course, is part of the Connecticut Compromise that was ultimately decided on. Okay, where does Congress derive its constitutional powers? Well, it's Article 1 of the Constitution. It wasn't by accident that the Constitution dealt with Congress first. It would be certainly the preeminent lawmaking authority when it came to American government, but really the preeminent governing body in the minds of many of the framers of the Constitution. So that's why we start with Congress in Article 1, the executive branch in Article 2, and the judiciary in Article 3. In Section 8 of the Constitution, it gives Congress some very specific enumerated authority, control of money, regulation of trade between the states and beyond state borders, regulation of the military, regulation of the court structure, and so forth. The necessary and proper clause in Article 1 also says that Congress has the powers to make laws that are essential to carry out its express powers. The question was at that point, how expansive would this elastic clause be? Early decision by the Supreme Court under Marshall said it validated these implied powers and indicated that they would be that Congress would be given a great deal of latitude to carry out its expressed powers. Okay, let's talk about the primary functions of Congress. First and foremost, the number one job of Congress is lawmaking. It's crafting laws, is making bills. Bills are prospective laws, and if they agree between the House and the Senate, it goes on to the president's desk for a signature or maybe even a veto. This is an important thing to remember. I mean, we often think about our member of Congress and we ask, well, do we like them? We look at it as sort of a popularity contest. We often don't think a whole lot about what bills are they working on? Are they taking leading positions in key policy areas or not? Many people often turn to members of Congress for constituent service, or what we also refer to as casework. For example, if people are not getting a Social Security benefit or a benefit as a military veteran that they think they're entitled to, they might reach out to their member of Congress to fight on their behalf with relevant bureaucracies at the federal level. There's the issue of representation is a controversial one. Is it the job of members of Congress simply to represent the people of the district, do what they want, whatever public opinion in that district indicates they should do, or are they there as a trustee? They were selected and they'll make the decision and they'll do what's in the best interest of their district, their state, and the country as a whole. And as you can imagine, there's tension between those things. People might say, "Hey, I sent you to Washington D.C. to reduce taxes, and yet I'm saying higher taxes, and your support maybe for higher taxes." But of course, the issue is on so many policy areas, individual voters might support two things that are in tension with each other. They might support more federal benefits and lower taxes, for example. Congress also serves in an oversight role. Congress has the power of the purse strings in our system. They will ultimately vote on a budget. They will determine funding. And that also gives Congress the power to hold hearings and look at whether or not the money is being spent within the intent of the law, and whether or not those resources are being spent effectively. So Congress will engage in oversight of the military, they'll engage in oversight of the federal bureaucracy, and in some cases restructure it and defund it or move money around to better get the results that were intended. In some cases, Congress engages in public education. Several years ago, Congress ran a number of joint committees that looked at steroids in baseball and whether or not this was becoming an epidemic. And a lot of people thought that it was. You had, 40-year-old players that were all of a sudden doubling in size and hitting more home runs than ever. So Congress, 10, 15 years ago, had public hearings when it came to steroids in baseball. At the time, that was kind of controversial as to whether or not that was the best thing they ought to be doing with their time. But anyway, it's an example of that. And then in some cases, conflict resolution. If there's big issues with regard to unions and a large-scale strike, Congress may hold hearings to engage in a resolution of the issue between um, uh, the union interests and the collective bargaining interests and labor and the industries themselves. So that would be an example of that. Some key differences between the House and Senate. Well, most obviously, the size of the two houses. The Senate has 100 members, the House has 435. And because the House is so much larger than the Senate, you need a lot more formal rules. And the Senate, in many cases, there's almost unlimited debate. You need 60 votes in the Senate to shut down debate and move on. And if you don't have that 60 votes, in many cases, members of the Senate can essentially talk a bill to death. They can just keep talking and debating on an issue forever. That's not the case in the House. Have much higher levels of prestige in the Senate. It's often been joked that among the 100 senators, you tend to have about 90 people who want to be president of the United States. They figure they've won a statewide election, and that's the next obvious step. Members of the House, they represent much smaller districts, and they have not won, obviously, statewide elections in most cases. A little more detail here. Members of the House have shorter terms in office, 2 years versus 6 years in the Senate. That's one of the reasons why they tend to be much more partisan. They're facing voters every other year. Members of the Senate can take a much more long-term approach. They tend to be less partisan, much more formal rules in the House because you have more members, and you wouldn't get anything through the House unless you had stricter rules. The rules are much looser in the Senate, and that's one of the reasons why bills tend to take a lot longer in the Senate, even though the Senate has many fewer people. The House represents a narrow constituency. House districts tend to be, particularly these days, due to gerrymandering, very Republican or very Democratic, very conservative or very liberal, whereas members of the Senate have to represent a whole state, so they tend to have a much more broader constituency. I won't go through each of these. Some of this I've already explored. Members of Congress demographically are older, wealthier, whiter, better educated than the general public. Relatively few women, but this is starting to change. We have the highest levels of women in both the House and Senate today at about 20%. But again, that's far less than the 50% of the population that they represent. See a large number of lawyers in both houses of Congress. There's a lot of reasons for this. The text explores this. One of the reasons, too, is that, it kind of does make sense because the role of the House and Senate, the most important one, is to craft a law. And so it does make sense that you're going to have a high concentration of people who are trained in that responsibility. The current congressional salary is $174,000, which to many of us seems like a good amount. But, we also have to keep in mind that in many cases people need to have a place to live in Washington, D.C. and their home district as well. So in a lot of cases, you have people who are running for office after they've already accumulated wealth. In some cases, you have people who are actually living off this salary, but in even more cases, you have people who come to the office with some resources. This data from your textbook just illustrates the differences that we tend to see between Congress and the demographics of the country as a whole. So spend a little time with that. Congressional elections, they are conducted by state governments. So voting rules, as we explored in the last chapter, they vary quite a bit from state to state. We've already discussed that the House of Representatives, they're elected every 2 years, the Senate every 6 years. In the House, the number of seats are determined by population. So the 435 members of the House of Representatives doesn't change, but how they're allocated among the states does change based on the last census. So in some cases, a state might lose a member of the House, or they might gain a member of the House, depending on if their population has grown or decreased. Each district has about 500,000 residents, if you were to put it on average, if you were to look at those 435 seats. In the Senate, we know that every state, regardless whether it's a tiny state in terms of its population like Wyoming or a big state like New York, they get 2 senators no matter what. Initially, members of the Senate were selected by state legislatures, but since the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, they are determined directly by voters. So every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate is up for reelection. So they don't do it all at once. It's not every 6 years. It's every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate is up for reelection. The presidential election certainly has some impacts on how, on whether or not people win election or reelection as a senator or member of Congress. When you're running with a popular presidential candidate, this is referred to as the presidential candidate having coattail effects. That is, you can imagine somebody's coattail. Can you ride them into victory? And so if you have a popular candidate for the presidency, they can help you. If not, they might have what we refer to as negative coattails. They don't do anything good for you. They might actually hurt you. So we do see this happen. And so not only do presidential elections matter in terms of who wins the presidency, but they also will help or hurt members of Congress who are seeking election or reelection. The vast majority of members of Congress who seek reelection win reelection. And this is referred to as the power of incumbency. There's a lot of reasons for this. You have name recognition. It's much easier for you to raise money. People are much likelier to donate money to a political campaign of somebody who's already in Congress than somebody who is challenging somebody for Congress. And there are other forces at work here too. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, every 10 years after the census, all 435 congressional districts are reapportioned. That means some states get more seats, some states lose a seat, and then all the lines are redrawn because you can't have one district with a different population than another district. Let's say that you've got a state with 10 congressional districts and each one has 500,000 voters in it. Well, those people are going to move around every 10 years. So even if you don't lose a seat or gain a seat, you're still going to need to redistrict because the Supreme Court has ruled one person, one vote. You can't have one district that's 200,000 people and another district that's 800,000 people. They have to be as equal as possible. Now, you would think this redrawing a line would be relatively straightforward, but it is seen as an opportunity by both political parties to some degree every 10 years to redraw the lines in a way that makes perhaps one seat safe or easier to pick up another congressional seat. And this process of redrawing the districts to get a favorable advantage in the election, that's referred to as gerrymandering. So spend some time in the reading understanding this. Understand the strategies of packing voters into one district or cracking up voters into multiple districts to achieve a partisan advantage. I want you to spend some time looking into that and share your thoughts on it in discussion this week. This is an old illustration, but this is where the term gerrymander came from. The Governor Gerry in Massachusetts, it was named for him. And this is, some of the first attempts to draw lines in a way that would allow for partisan advantage. Here's some examples of some creative gerrymanders today. You can see these districts that were drawn in such a way for partisan advantage for one political party or the other. Like I said, there's only a few rules that the Supreme Court has been willing to establish when it comes to drawing of congressional districts. One, that again, the one person, one vote rule, you need to have the districts roughly of equal size within each state population-wise. The other is that they have to be contiguous. That means they have to all be part of one district. Even if it's just the width of a single road, they have to be contiguous. Most of the real power, the real decision making in Congress is through its committee structure. And you can think of congressional committees as mini legislatures that are dealing with their area of responsibility. So standing committees are permanent committees. They would deal with things like the budget or armed services. Select committees are temporary committees, although they could go on for a long time. You could have a select committee that's dealing with terrorism, for example. Joint committees are committees that have members of both the House and the Senate. And the most powerful form of joint committee is a conference committee. A conference committee is the committee that is formed after a bill comes out of the House and a bill comes out of the Senate to work out the differences between the two bills and send them. And once they agree on that, send it back to the two legislative houses for final approval. Just a brief overview of the permanent standing committees between the House and the Senate. You'll also notice here that there's a lot more committees in the House than there are in the Senate. The Senate committees are fewer, but each individual one handles more things. It makes sense, right? There's more members of the House than there are members of the Senate. All right, let's discuss the leadership structure in the United States Congress. First of all, the preeminent power holder in the House of Representatives is the Speaker of the House. Both parties will put up a candidate for Speaker of the House, and whatever party is in the majority will obviously win that. So currently that's Nancy Pelosi. Very powerful position. The Speaker of the House ultimately sets the agenda for the House of Representatives, determines how debate will carry out on individual bills, has a lot to say when it comes to who's going to chair the different committees. And as we discussed earlier, the House of Representatives has a lot more formal rules, and the Speaker of the House ultimately implements those rules and decides on those rules. So a great deal of power there. The House Majority Leader is the top lieutenant to the Speaker of the House, and also underneath them is the Majority Whip. And an easy way to remember this is it's the job of the whips to whip their caucus, whip their political party into shape, keep the membership in line on key bills, make sure that the support's there. And the leadership has a lot of power over the individual members of the House. They can promote them and give them higher ranking assignments as chairs of the different committees. They can support them for reelection or not support them for reelection. So there's a great deal of authority, there's a great deal of leverage that the leadership has to keep people in order. The highest ranking member of the minority is the minority leader, and underneath them also a minority whip that is essentially doing the same thing, whipping the caucus into shape and making sure that the party is staying together. In the United States Senate, it's a little bit more complex. Of course, different terminology is being used just to confuse students of American politics. The President of the Senate, who's the Vice President of the United States, as well as the President pro tem of the Senate, these are essentially ceremonial positions. They have the right to preside over the Senate, to actually bang that gavel, and to run the meeting, but the real power is in the majority leader. Currently, that's Mitch McConnell because Republicans control a majority of the United States Senate. Now, the Vice President of the United States, when they do preside over the Senate, it can be a very big deal because that means people are anticipating a tie vote. And in those cases where it is a tie vote, the Vice President of the United States gets to make the tiebreaker. Now, as I mentioned before, while the majority leader is the preeminent power holder in the United States Senate, they're not nearly as powerful as the Speaker of the House. They don't have as much control over debate. Rules are not as formalized in the United States Senate as they are relative to the House. It takes 60 votes to shut down debate, so individual senators have a lot more latitude when it comes to dominating debate and extending debate if they want to, and using debate as a tool, unlimited debate as a tool, as you know from your reading, is referred to as the filibuster. Underneath both the majority and the minority leaders in the Senate, likewise, you have the whips, and as in the House, they serve a similar function. As you know, a bill is a prospective law, and for a bill to become a law, it needs to go through both houses of the Congress, and the differences need to be worked out and onto the desk of the president for his signature. All money bills, bills that have to do with taxation or spending, those need to originate in the House of Representatives, but ultimately the Senate needs to agree with the House on any such measures. So the Senate ultimately has equal power in that area. The House of Representatives structure is there's an introduction of a bill. It is referred to as a committee. It goes through a rules committee before floor debate. Now that's different from the Senate because, as I mentioned, there are fewer formal rules in the Senate. Individual senators have a lot more latitude when it comes to debate. As you might imagine, the bill that comes out of the House and the related bill that comes out of the Senate, they are often quite different when they go through the legislative process. So in most cases, the final step is a conference committee to work out these differences before there's one more final vote in the House and the Senate of this compromise bill. And this committee that works out those differences are referred to as a conference committee, and they're composed of members of both the House and the Senate. Very powerful because they work out those final details. I'll have a link up online too to the fun "How a Bill Becomes a Law" cartoon from my youth, so you can take a look at that if you're interested. Again, just a visual overview of how a bill becomes a law. So take a look at this. It's in your text as well. To summarize, the authors of the Constitution believe that the bulk of power, and particularly lawmaking power, should be in the legislature. Our current structure in the United States Congress comes from the Connecticut Compromise, which designed the House to be based on population and the Senate to be based on equality of the states. So each state has 2 senators regardless of size. As I mentioned earlier, due to the larger size, the House has a greater number of formal rules. That gives individual members of the House less power relative to the Senate. Most incumbents, whether it be for the House or Senate, win re-election. And just to review, an incumbent is someone who is currently in the elected position. Congressional district boundaries are redrawn every 10 years in a redistricting process. And if that is done so in a partisan way to benefit one party or one candidate over another party or another candidate, we refer to this as gerrymandering. And this is a big deal because we're about to start the redistricting process for 2020 following the 2020 census. And as I mentioned too, most of the work of legislating is performed in committees and subcommittees. This is where the real power is in Congress, the leadership within these committees. And so the bills that come out of these committees, they set the stage for debate before the whole House and the House of Representatives or in the Senate. And that is where the real power is in both legislative houses.
And here are your guiding questions for the week. They will be posted in the weekly discussion area, and again, 1 substantial original post and at least 2 responses to your classmates' on-topic posts. We are here in week 9. We're more than halfway complete with the course, so if you have any questions regarding your process, please reach out to me and connect with me during the weekly Zoom meetings. I want to make sure, obviously, that everybody is on a path to successfully complete the course. Have a great week.